Hello, everybody. Welcome to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today is one of a collection of stories that is known as either the Tales of the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights. This was actually a couple of stories that were told on some of those 1001 nights, and I put them all together the way they should be. This is the story of the fisherman and the genie. Once long ago, on the shores of the great sea of Persia, there lived a fisherman, and he had a wife and several children. He was not a very rich fisherman, but he was a very kind fisherman, and every day as he would leave the house to go to the shore and row out in his boat and to gather the fish, his family would say to him, "Father, catch some good fish today. We pray that Allah will bless you with lots of fish." And he said, "Well, if Allah blesses me with enough fish to feed my family, that will be enough for me." Well, one day, the fisherman went out and he cast his net into the water. And when he pulled it back toward him, it was so heavy that he couldn't even pull it into the boat, and he just had to row to the land, pulling the net behind him. And then when he got to the shore, he pulled it out of the water, and it was so heavy that he almost couldn't get it out of the water. And he was thinking that he must have caught a very big fish. But much to his surprise, when he finally got the net pulled out of the water, it was not a big fish in the net. It was a very big brass jar. Now, this jar was almost as tall as the fisherman himself, and he noticed very quickly as he was looking at this brass jar and thinking that perhaps he might get a gold coin in the bazaar for this jar when he sold it in the marketplace. But he noticed that there was a lid on the jar, and that the lid of the jar was sealed with a very ancient-looking leaden seal. Well, if you seal a jar, chances are good you're putting something inside of it. And so the fisherman thought that perhaps he might find out what was inside the jar. For if the jar itself was worth one gold coin, what was inside might be worth a few more. And so he took out his knife and he broke the leaden seal on the jar, and he took off the lid and he looked inside of the jar. And he was very surprised to discover that the jar was empty. But just then, there was a swooshing and a whooshing and a whooshing sound, and suddenly a great column of smoke began to come out of the jar, and it swirled up into the air, and the fisherman was so startled that he stumbled backwards and tripped over a rock and fell down flat on the ground, and he was staring up at the sky, and this giant column of smoke came out of the jar. And suddenly it began to form itself into the shape of a person, maybe. And this person was so big that his head touched the clouds, and then suddenly his feet, like great tree trunks, and his legs came out of the jar and stamped into the sand. And suddenly the fisherman knew that he was not looking at a person. No. This must be a genie. Now, genies can be dangerous, or genies can be very kind. And he wasn't really sure which one he was looking at here, but he was so very big that the fisherman was rather scared. And so finally, he scrambled up to his feet and he looked up at the genie and he said, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" And the genie looked down at him and said, "I am a genie, and I have been in that jar for 1,000 years. Now, mortal, you today shall die a most terrible death. How would you wish to die?" "Well, I do not wish to die at all," said the fisherman. "Well," said the genie, "it does not matter. You shall die a terrible death. How do you wish to die?" Well, the fisherman was thinking very fast, and all he could think was he wanted a little more time think about this and see if he could figure out a way to not have to die. And so he said to the genie, "Genie, I do not understand. Why do I have to die? Could you possibly maybe tell me your story?" Well, the genie looked a little puzzled at that, but then he said, "Very well. I was once, long, long ago, a bad genie. I did the wrong things and I broke the genie rules. And so the gods bottled me up in that jar and sealed it up and threw it into the ocean. And in that jar I have been for the last 1,000 years, rolling about on the bottom of the ocean." He said, "When I had been in the jar for 100 years, I made a vow that the person who freed me from the jar, I would make richer than they could ever dream." "Well, but I have freed you from the jar," said the fisherman. You should be making me rich, not threatening to kill me." And the genie said, "No, for you see, at the end of another 900 years, when I had been in that jar for almost 1,000 years, I decided that I would kill the first person that I saw when I got out. And that is you, fisherman. So, how do you wish to die?" Well, the fisherman had been thinking this whole time, even while he was listening to the genie's story, and he thought he might have come up with a solution. He said, "Well, I don't mean to sound rude, Mr. Genie, but I don't actually believe you. Your story sounds a bit fishy." "What do you mean my story sounds fishy?" He said, "Well, I'm sorry, but you're so very big. And this jar, I mean, it is a large jar, but it's so very much smaller than you. I do not believe that you fit inside of that jar, that you were inside of that jar for 1,000 years. I do not believe it. I am sorry." The genie said, "You do not believe that I fit in that jar? I will prove to you that I fit in that jar." And with a swoosh and a whoosh and a flump, the genie turned into smoke again and descended into the jar. Well, as soon as the genie was completely inside of the jar, the fisherman jumped up and put the lid back on the jar as fast as he could. And he said, "Ah ha ha! Now, genie, how should you wish to die? For I am going to throw this jar back into the water, and then I am going to build a house right here on the shore. And if anyone comes here to fish, I am going to tell them they had better not. And you will be stuck in this jar forever at the bottom of the ocean. You will never get out again." And the genie, when he realized how he'd been tricked, began to wail and to cry out, and he said, "Please, fisherman, let me out. Do not leave me stuck in this jar." And the fisherman said, "No, you tried to kill me. I am not going to let you out." And the genie said, Fisherman, if you let me out, I promise, I vow, I promise that I will make you richer than you ever dreamed." The fisherman said, "I do not trust you." And he started to drag the jar back towards the water. And the genie said, Fisherman, I promise, on my life, I promise. I will make you richer than you ever dreamed. I will not kill you. I promise. Well, the fisherman, he was a very kind man, and he really did not want to throw the genie back in the water. He just didn't want to die. And so he still wasn't sure he believed the genie, but the genie was promising. And so finally the fisherman stopped dragging the jar towards the water, and he took the lid off again. And no sooner had he done that than the genie came flying out of the bottle as fast as he could out of the jar. And as soon as he had turned solid again, he turned around and he gave that jar a great big kick with his big foot. And the jar went spinning out into the ocean and disappeared beneath the waves forever. Well, now the fisherman was a little frightened, for he was sure that the genie was going to kill him now. The genie looked at the fisherman and he laughed and he said, Fisherman, really, Do you not believe that genies will keep their word? I promise to make you richer than you ever dreamed, and I will keep that promise. Come with me now." And he turned around and he started to walk off. Well, the fisherman had a bit of difficulty keeping up with the genie, for of course the genie was very large, and the fisherman, well, he wasn't really small, but compared to the genie he was. And so he had to trot, kind of run a little bit to keep up with the genie, but he followed the genie. And as they went up a road that the fisherman had never been on before, and they went up into the mountains, and suddenly in front of them were 4 black mountains, black hills, right there around a black lake. Well, the fisherman thought this area looked a little bit frightening. After all, everything was black, and that is not the normal color for mountains or water. But the genie simply turned and gestured the fisherman to come with him again, and walked out into the lake. The genie walked out into the lake until the water was just above his ankles. The fisherman walked out into the lake just as far, and the water there was right around his waist. Then the genie said, "Look down into the water, fisherman." And the fisherman looked down into the water, and much to his surprise, he found that when you were in the water, it wasn't actually black. It was quite clear. And swimming about in the water were the oddest fish he had ever seen. They were blue fish and white fish and red fish and yellow fish, and, well, he'd never seen a fish that looked quite so sad before. All of the fish looked very sad. The genie said, "Fisherman, put your net in the water here. Catch 1 fish of each color, and then take it to the Sultan's palace, and you will be made richer than you ever dreamed." "Well, all right," said the fisherman. So he took out his net and he dropped it in the water, and he caught 1 blue fish and 1 red fish and 1 yellow fish and 1 white fish. And then he pulled his net out of the water, and the genie said, "Good, you have your fish. Now remember, go to the Sultan and give him the fish as a gift, and you will be made richer than you ever dreamed." "Well, I will do that," said the fisherman. The genie said, "Good, now then, I am going to leave you, for I have been out of the world for 1,000 years, and there are many things that I must see and do." And before the fisherman could even say thank you or goodbye, the genie stamped his foot on the ground and disappeared in a puff of smoke, as though the earth had swallowed him up. Well, the fisherman thought all of this was rather odd, but the genie had told him something to do and had promised to make him richer than he ever dreamed possible. So he started to do what the genie had told him. He took those 4 fish and he carried them to the capital city, to the Sultan's palace. And when he got there, he went to the door and he told the guards that he had a gift for the Sultan. And the guards took the message into the palace. And they told the Sultan, who was sitting with all of his courtiers thinking about what good food might be coming for dinner. He was getting rather hungry. It was getting late in the day. And he was thinking about what might be for dinner when the guards came in and told him that there was a fisherman at the gate who said that he had a gift for the Sultan. And the Sultan said, "Oh, goody, perhaps he has something delicious for us to have for dinner. Bring him in." And so they brought the fisherman in. And he displayed for the Sultan, the 4 beautiful, strangely colored fishes, the blue one, the red one, the white one, and the yellow one. And the Sultan said, "Well, those are the most unusual fish I've ever seen. I do believe we should have them for supper." And so he sent them down to the kitchens. And then he gave the fisherman a bag full of 100 gold coins for those 4 unusual fish. And he sent him home. And the fisherman went home very happy indeed. But when the cook took those 4 fish in the kitchens and she put them on the hot pan to fry, No sooner did the fish begin to sizzle just a little bit in the hot oil than the wall of the kitchen opened up and a beautiful princess came out. She was very beautiful, but you could tell by looking at her that she was not very kind. And she proved it just a moment later, for she walked up to the pan and she had a stick in her hand, and she hit the fish in the pan with the stick, and she said, "Fry, fish, fry! Is the fat not hot enough for you? Fry!" And the fish stood up on their tails, and they started crying out, "Save us! Save us!" And the poor cook was so frightened by all of this that she fainted dead away. When she woke up a few minutes later, she found that the princess was gone, the wall was closed, and the fish in the pan were burned to charcoal. They were not going to be edible at all. Well, the cook was a little bit frightened by this, for she was afraid that the Sultan might punish her for burning his supper. But she knew that the truth is always the best way to deal with a problem like this, and so she went to the Sultan and she explained to him what had happened. The Sultan thought that was the oddest story he had ever heard, and he wanted to see this beautiful princess for himself. And so the next morning he sent for the fisherman again. And the fisherman came, and he was a bit worried, for he thought perhaps the fish had made the Sultan sick and the Sultan was going to punish him. But when he arrived, the Sultan simply said to him, "Fisherman, I would like you to get me 4 more fish of those beautiful colored fish. Could you do that for me?" And the fisherman said, "Well, yes, of course, Sultan, I can do that for you." And so he left, and he walked up to the black lake between the 4 black hills, and he lowered his net into the water, and he caught 1 blue fish, 1 red fish, 1 yellow fish, and 1 white fish. And then he brought them back to the Sultan's palace. And the Sultan took the fish, and he thanked the fisherman for them, and he gave him another bag with 100 gold coins in it. And the fisherman went home rejoicing. The Sultan took the fish down to the kitchen, and he gave them to the cook, and he said, "Cook, I want you to do exactly what you did last night with these fish. Don't change anything. I'm going to go over there." And he hid behind a column in the kitchen, a big pillar in the kitchen, and he watched as the cook prepared the fish, and then she put them in the pan with the hot oil in it. And as soon as they began to sizzle in the hot oil, the wall opened up. But instead of a beautiful princess, what came out was a big, ugly slave. And he too had a stick, and he walked up to the pan and he said, "Fry, fish, fry!" And he hit the fish in the pan with his stick. And the fish stood up on their tails and they said, "Save us! Save us! Save us!" And then the big ugly slave leaned forward with his stick, and he stirred up the pan and the oil in the pan, and like that, the fish in the pan were burnt black and not edible at all. And the slave turned around and he disappeared back into the wall, and the wall closed up, and the Sultan came out from behind the pillar, very surprised indeed. Well, the next morning he sent for the fisherman again, and he said, "Fisherman, I need to know where you got those fish." And the fisherman said, "Well, Sultan, they come from the black lake that is surrounded by the 4 black hills." And the Sultan said, "Is it very far away?" The fisherman said, "Oh, no, not at all, Sultan. Maybe a half an hour's walk from here." And the Sultan said, "I do not think you are telling me the truth. For you see, I know every inch of my kingdom, and there is no black lake surrounded by 4 black hills." And the fisherman said, "But Sultan, there is. I have fetched the fish for you for 2 days now from that lake." And the Sultan said, "Well then, I need you to take me there." And he and several of his courtiers and their slaves and their servants got together a party with tents and food and all sorts of things that they needed. And they went and they followed the fisherman up into the hills. And the fisherman took them to the black lake with the 4 black hills around it. And the Sultan said, "Now this is very odd, for I do not remember ever seeing this part of my kingdom before." And he questioned all of the courtiers and all of the servants and all of the slaves, and none of them had ever seen it before either. And so the Sultan said, "Well, this is a very strange thing, and I will not go home to my palace until I have figured out where this lake and these hills and these fish came from. These fish, look at the fish. They all look so sad, and there's so many different colors. Fish do not usually come in these colors." And so they pitched their tents and they set up their camps. The fisherman was allowed to go home. And the Sultan and all of his courtiers and his servants and his slaves settled down for the night to take a rest. But the Sultan could not sleep. And as he lay there in his tent, he was thinking about how he was going to find out the secret of the colorful fish and the black lake and the black hills. And suddenly it came to him that the answer to his questions must be somewhere further up in the hills. And so he decided that he was going to go alone into the hills and find out what was going on here. And so the very next morning, very early, before anyone else was awake, the Sultan got up and he very quietly got dressed, and he took his sword and he went up into the hills and he began looking for the secret of the fish and the lake and the black hills. And when all of his courtiers and his servants and his slaves woke up later that morning and they could not find the Sultan anywhere, they realized that he must have gone out to have an adventure, and they decided to wait for him until he came back. Well, meanwhile, the Sultan was walking through the hills, and he walked for a day and a night. And at the beginning of the next day, he saw something gleaming off in the distance. And when he went closer, he saw that it was a building. And when he got even closer, he saw that it was a palace. And when he got closer still, he saw that the entire palace was made out of black stone. It looked a little eerie. After all, it was a big black palace, and the Sultan wasn't used to palaces being that color. But the doors were open, which usually meant that nobody coming inside would be treated like an enemy. And so the Sultan decided to go inside and see if someone inside could tell him the secret of the fish and the lake and the hills. And so he went inside. But when he got inside, he was made even more uneasy, for the palace seemed to be deserted. There were no people anywhere to be seen. He wandered through room after room after room, into courtyards and through gardens. It was a very beautiful palace with beautiful hangings on the wall and rich carpets on the floors. Whoever had lived here must have been very rich indeed, the Sultan realized. But he just couldn't find a single other person. Well, eventually he came to a fountain that was beautifully carved and covered in mosaic tiles and beautiful colors, and the water that sparkled out of it looked like diamonds jumping through the air. And by this time the Sultan was rather thirsty and rather tired too, so he thought he might sit down and have a bit of a drink and a bit of a rest. And so he had a drink from the fountain, and then he sat down to rest. But as he was sitting there, he realized that he was hearing a strange sound. And when he listened a little more, he realized that it sounded rather like someone was crying. And so he got up and he followed the sound. And it led him to a room that had a gold curtain hanging over the door. And so the Sultan opened the curtain and he stepped inside the room. And much to his surprise, he found a person. He was a rather young, handsome young man. He looked as though he might be royal. He had very rich clothing on and a crown on his head, and he was sitting on a golden embroidered cushion on the floor. But he was crying. And when the Sultan came closer, the young man heard him and he lifted up his head. And he saw the Sultan and he said, "Who are you and where did you come from?" And the Sultan explained where he had come from, and he said, "I am looking for someone to tell me the secret of the fish and the lake and the black hills that I have never seen before in my kingdom." "But my friend," he said, "why do you sit here crying? And where are all of the people from your palace?" And the young man said, now that is a story." And he lifted up the blanket that was laying over his lap. And suddenly the Sultan could see that from the waist down, the young man was made of stone. He could not move, for his legs would not move. He was a statue from the bottom, from his waist down. And the Sultan said, "How did this happen to you?" And he said, "Oh, I shall tell you the story of how this happened to me, and then you shall know the secret of the fish and the lake and the hills. This was done to me by an ogress and an evil slave." And the Sultan, he thought about it and he thought, there was a slave that came to my palace and the beautiful princess. He said, "Who are this ogress and this slave?" And the young man said, "Sit down, my friend, and I shall tell you the story. You see, I married a beautiful woman, but unfortunately, she was only beautiful on the outside. On the inside, she was an ogress. And the slave, well, she ran away from me with the slave. And I grew angry, and so I went to where they were to kill them. And I drew my sword, and I hit the slave in the neck, and I thought I had killed him, and then I came home. But as it turns out, I did not kill him. I only stabbed him in the neck, and I made it so that he could not speak any longer, but he was still alive. And the ogress, who had been my wife, came after me, and she was very angry, and she came in to fight with me and to yell at me. And I tried to draw my sword, but before I could, she cast a spell on me, and this is what happened. As you see, she made me half stone. And every day, she comes in and she feeds me pieces of boiled rat and a little bit of water, and then she beats me, and then she leaves. And the Sultan said, "That is terrible. Where is the ogress now?" And he said, "Well, I do not know, for she does not stay in the palace every day." And the Sultan said, "And the slave? Where is the slave?" And the young man said, "Well, the slave, he is recovering. He will eventually be able to get up and walk about, but he still cannot speak. He is across the courtyard in another room." And the Sultan said, "I will help you, my friend." And the young man said, "As I am the king of the Black Isles, I would love it very much if you would help me. For if you help me, you will also help my people. For after the ogress cast the spell on me, she changed my city into the lake, and my people into the fish of blue and yellow and red and white. And the 4 islands of my kingdom she made into the 4 black hills that you saw. So if you can save me and defeat the ogress, then you can also save my people, and I would very much appreciate that." And the Sultan said, "Well, I shall see what I can do." And he went out into the courtyard, and he went across to the other side, and he found the room where the slave was hiding. The slave was sleeping when the Sultan came into the room, and he came across the room, and he pulled his sword from its scabbard. And when he did so, the slave woke up, and he tried to yell out, but he still had no voice. And so very soon, the Sultan killed the slave. And he took the slave's body and he hid it. And then he took the cloak that the slave had been wrapped in, and he wrapped himself in it, and he laid back down on the bed in the room. Well, the next morning, the ogress came in to visit. And she said, I pray to Allah every day that your voice may be restored and you will be healthy and strong again. And the Sultan, who was laying there, made his voice sound as weak as he possibly could, and he said, please, could I have some wine? And the ogress said, oh, thank the gods, you are being cured, your voice is coming back. Now, you might be surprised that the ogress didn't recognize that it wasn't the slave in the bed, but the truth is the Sultan and the slave were about the same size, and the room was rather dark. There was only one little lamp in the far corner, and other than that, you really couldn't see, so it was no real surprise that the ogress did not realize that it was not her slave in the bed. And so she said, I hope very much that you will be healed very, very soon, my love. And he said, well, I think I shall be, but there is something you could do to make me heal faster. And she said, oh, what is that? I will do it gladly. And he said, well, your husband, the king, he cries every night, and it keeps me awake. If you could release him from the spell you put him under, then I think I would be able to sleep better, and I would be able to get stronger faster. And she said, I will do that. I will release him from the spell and send him from this place. And she took a bowl of water and she went into the room where the king was sitting. The king of the Black Isles was sitting on his golden cushion. And she threw the water about the room and she cried out in a terrible voice, O gods of demons and spirits, take away this curse that I have given. And suddenly, the king of the Black Isles no longer had stone legs, but flesh and bone there again, and he was able to stand up and move about. And the ogress said to him, now I have freed you because my slave asked me to, and now go from this place and do not return. And so the king of Black Isles left the room. And the ogress went back to her slave, or what she thought was her slave, and she said, I have freed my husband from the curse that he was under. Now you can heal and grow stronger. And the Sultan made his voice just a little bit stronger sounding. And he said, there is another thing you could do. I can hear the cries and the misery of the people that you turned into fish. Reverse the curse on the lake. Make it back into the city, and the fish back into people, and the hills back into the islands. And I am sure I would get stronger faster. And the ogress said, I will do that. And she went running out to the side of the lake and she reversed the curse. Much to the surprise of the Sultan's servants and slaves and courtiers, who had been sitting about in their little tents under their awnings, waiting for the Sultan to come back and discussing how long they should wait before they went out looking for him. And one minute they were sitting on the grass next to a black lake with 4 black hills surrounding them, and the next minute they were watching all of the fish in the lake stand up on their tails and suddenly grow taller and become people. And then the lake disappeared, and suddenly they were in the middle of a bazaar in the marketplace, and there was a city around them, and the black hills were gone, and instead in the distance you could see 4 black islands. The courtiers were very, very surprised, as you might imagine. Well, the ogress, once she had reversed the curse, she went running back to her slave and she said, oh, my love, I have taken the curse off of the city and the people and the islands. And you will get stronger now, I am sure, so much faster. And the Sultan said, indeed, I feel a bit stronger. Come closer. And the ogress came closer. And as she got quite close, suddenly she realized this was not her slave in the bed in front of her. But by then it was too late, for she was quite close enough for the Sultan, who pulled out his sword and chopped off her head. and the ogress was no more. And then the Sultan got up, and he cleaned his sword, and he went looking for the King of the Black Isles, and he found him near the gate of the palace. And he said, "Your people are restored to you, your kingdom is restored to you, and I am very glad to see that you are up and walking about." And the King of the Black Isles said, "I thank you very much, my friend. Shall we go to the city and see my people?" And the Sultan said, "I think that is a good plan." And so they went to the city. And the Sultan's courtiers were very happy to see him back again, and very surprised to hear the story that he told them. And the Sultan himself was a bit surprised to hear just how suddenly his people had gone from being on the grass near a lake to in the marketplace in a city. And the Sultan and the King of the Black Isles became very good friends. And the King of the Black Isles said to the Sultan, "I would like to thank you for giving me back my life and my people and my lands. How can I thank you?" And the Sultan said, "Well, I think I do like to have a good party. How would it be if you came to my city and we had a great feast to celebrate the fact that your country is restored to you?" And the King of the Black Isles looked at the Sultan, and he smiled, and he said, "I do not think it will be quite so easy as you think to go to your city and have a party." And the Sultan said, "Oh no, it is quite near. It is only but about a half a day's walk." And the King of the Black Isles began to laugh, and he said, "Well, I can see that you too were under the spell of the ogress at least a little bit. For I know your city, O Sultan, and it is a year away from here, not a day. It will take us quite a while to get there." And the Sultan said, "A year? Well, that is odd. Nevertheless, I should still like you to come to my city and see it and have a feast with me." And so the King of the Black Isles said, "Very well." And together with the Sultan's courtiers and servants and slaves and some of the King of the Black Isles' courtiers and servants and slaves, they began the journey. And it did indeed take a full year to get back to the Sultan's city. When the Sultan arrived back in his city, the people were overjoyed to see him, for they had begun to think they would never see their Sultan again. And the Sultan had a great feast and a wonderful party to celebrate the fact that he had made friends with the King of the Black Isles, and that the King of the Black Isles was free of his curse. And in all of his joy and all of his celebration, the Sultan did not forget the fisherman who had brought him this wonderful friend by bringing him the colorful fish. And he sent for the fisherman, and he told the fisherman the whole story of what had happened. And he said, "Fisherman, I should like to reward you for giving me such wonderful fish that led to such a wonderful adventure and my very good friend. Do you have any children?" And the fisherman was a little startled, and he said, "Well, yes, O Sultan, I have 3. I have 2 daughters and 1 son, and none of them are married yet, but they should be soon. They are of the right age." And the Sultan said, "Very well, send for them." And he sent for the fisherman's wife and children. And when they came, the fisherman's daughters were married, one to the son of the Sultan and the other to the King of the Black Isles. And the Sultan made the fisherman's son his chief treasurer, and he gave the fisherman a lot of gold. And he made him his very good friend and treated him like a brother for the rest of his life. And the fisherman, he was richer than he had ever dreamed possible. He was one of the richest men in the kingdom. But as rich as he was, he never did go fishing again. But he did like to go to the marketplace and tell the story of how his small encounter with the genie had saved an entire kingdom and his son-in-law, the King of the Black Isles, and how small kindnesses, like not throwing the genie back into the lake, into the ocean, can lead to big rewards. And that is the tale of the fisherman and the genie from the 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back and join us again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Time. We will have another story for you here from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. See you later. Bye.